So you've been a independent developer for a while, and probably one of the most successful, being able to work on a lot of open source projects and produce a lot of very successful open source projects while working mostly on your own. And now you're going this route of, so you've raised some VC, you're forming Void Zero, you have a few people coming to join you to like work on these ecosystem tooling. So why did you decide to make that transition from independent developer to starting a company? And what about the timing or the circumstances make
hmm
this like a different choice?
I think overall, I would actually consider myself a pretty risk averse person. Some of the biggest decisions I'd made in my life, I feel like I just swinged it. But like going fully independent to work on Vue, I didn't really know what that would entail. Luckily, I think I built a lifestyle entrepreneurship kind of lifestyle business thing around Vue, so that is enough to support me and make my life sustainable. So on top of that, I'm not starting a company because, oh, we need to make more money. So that situation. It's more about starting the company is the more realistic way to essentially fulfill the vision that I'm trying to achieve. It's also partly based on the experience of working as an independent developer. I know where the limit of the current model can go. I think a lot of people use Vue and use me as a success story example for sustainability of independent projects. But at the same time, if you consider the scope of Vue, we have more than 2 million users supported by, I think at max, we had 3 people working full time on Vue related stuff. Like now it's probably still around 3 people that's actually full time on Vue. And then a bunch of part time contributors that we sponsor. It's sustainable, but at the same time, we don't really see it growing, say, to the scale where we can have like a team of 10 people working on it full time, right? Because I intentionally try to build the business around Vue to be as passive and carefree as possible. That's a lifestyle choice. But also, that means the conversion rate, because it's not a for profit business. Like, we don't do aggressive marketing or we don't push features to drive profit or revenue. So in a lot of ways, the conversion rate compared to the user count of Vue is extremely low, right? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. For me, there's no sort of this or that in terms of open source sustainability or monetization. I think it all comes down to the goal you're trying to achieve. For me, Vue is a lifestyle business thing, and I think that's working very well for me. I'm happy about that. But on the other hand, when I think about where Vite is going, and thinking about the potential that V has, and thinking about how we can actually, maximize that potential and make the thing we hope it can be. And I don't see it happening with this sort of more passive model of like just hoping people donate, hoping people sponsor, or hoping someone comes up with a business and decide to donate back to V, right? That's actually has a lot to do with I think it partly with luck. It takes time. It also has a lot to do with what layer the project stands on. For example, because Vue is a very user-facing framework, so most of the income that's generated by Vue is due to the exposure, due to the high exposure and documentation. And because when people use frameworks, they would likely interact with the documentation very constantly. Build tools is quite different, right? It usually sits one layer below the framework. And also, when you set up build tools, once you get it working, you're happy with it. You rarely have to actually look at the docs every day. Right? When we go even lower, say like we're building parsers and tool chains like that, I've seen how like projects like Babel struggle with funding despite such almost universal adoption across the ecosystem, right? So I don't think that model is going to work for the things we want to build. But at the same time, this is quite an ambitious goal. I can't imagine it being done with part-time efforts from just contributors who are like, oh, we want to work on this together. I don't think that's going to happen, or at least it's not going to happen soon enough. So I think the only realistic way for us to actually do it is to have enough resource capital to have to get people paid properly to work on a full time and as a team, right? So we have a common mission, a common goal, and it's much more serious than your let's contribute to open source after work or on weekends. It's different. So that also inevitably brings in the question like of expectations from investments and returns. And I think one of the other goals of starting a company is because I always felt like it's a bit sad that the JavaScript ecosystem is relying on a lot of critical infrastructure that's maintained by people that's either underpaid or just as labor of love, right? In a way, the ideal situation is we hope, okay, like big companies using these open source projects, making a lot of money, they should donate back, they should sponsor. And I think it's difficult because there is so much logistics that you have to go through to actually set up the proper organization like a foundations and align the incentives. And there's a lot of lobbying, a lot of like just talking to people and getting people on the same page and to make things like that happen. And smaller open source project authors really don't have the leverage or the time and the energy to make that kind of things happen. And it's uphill battle before you accidentally become the critical infrastructure the entire ecosystem relies on, right? So I think Vite Zero is also a different attempt where the end goal we hope is we have a sustainable business model that's mostly coming from bigger companies, enterprise that's paying money that allows us to keep improving these open source parts and keep it free and open source for individual users, for smaller companies, startups, so that more JavaScript developers have free access to high quality tools. At the same time, the tools should also be well sustained and maintained.
Is your plan for monetization like charging bigger companies to use the tools and then letting it be open source free for everybody else?
Not exactly. We want to draw a line where if the code runs on your machine, it should be open source and free, right? We don't want to do things like, so one thing we definitely don't do is to ship something as open source and change the license later and hope people pay for it, right? That's just not the plan. The plan is likely to build, we do have plans on building associated services that's tied into each step of the way. Because when you have a toolchain, you have natural tie into a lot of metadata every step of the way. And how do you get deeper insights from these metadata? And how can we get higher quality metadata for each task you're performing on your code base, right? Overall, I think there's good opportunity to improve upon what we're currently doing. For example, like how much deeper insights can we get from our bundles? Is your tree shaking accidentally failing? Is your chunk cache invalidation working consistently? Are you bundling things that shouldn't really be in the production bundle? And is your code, after your code is transformed by all these tools, is it still as secure as the source code pretends to be? Right? So there are a lot of questions that's hard to answer if you don't actually own the toolchain and be able to look at the source code from start all the way back, all the way to minified in production that you actually ship to the users. So I think there's quite a bit of opportunity here, and we're intended to essentially build services that's centered around this space. I can't do. I don't want to be too specific right now because there's obviously a lot of things that can change. There's some details we're still working on, but the idea here is there will be, if we make money, it's from services. It's not going to be from the open source stuff that we built directly. And the open source toolchain obviously serves as the funnel and the moat for the services that we built. And that's the ideal outcome.
I think that makes a lot of sense. There is this real thing of big companies using open source tooling. It usually doesn't scale super well. And if you've worked in a semi-large company and you've used Webpack, for example, and we have a 5 to 10 minute Webpack build. Like most people don't experience that because their apps are too small. But if you're a really large organization and you're bundling a lot of code and you're like running a lot of transforms and you're doing a lot of custom stuff, you start hitting in those things. So I think it makes sense to a large degree to say, hey, you've just got more needs and we have tools to solve those needs, whereas 80% of people won't ever hit that scaling point.
Totally. Yeah. A part of the reasons we believe there's a market for this is because half the team have worked at ByteDance on their web infra team, and they support some of the largest scale JavaScript applications that we have ever heard of in the industry, and some code bases with 100,000 lines of JavaScript code and takes half an hour to build. So scale that not every developer would have to ever deal with. But that's why a lot of the tools that we are building, like the starting from the OIC parser, is like we are obsessed with the highest level of performance so that these tools can still handle the scale. The biggest scale application you can throw at it, it should be able to still do it with decent development experience.